Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week we're going to be taking a look at the fabled Marshall BluesBreaker. Now, it is worth mentioning at this point that I'm of course referring to the pedal, not the amp of the same name. However, the two, albeit indirectly, are related. In 1966, John Mayall and the BluesBreakers released an album that would later become known as the Beano record, that, aside from giving rise to the birth of British blues, helped catapult a very young Eric Clapton near enough overnight into superstardom, or near deity status, depending on who you ask. Now, as much as it was Eric's sublime playing on that record that really helped cement his status, gave birth to a guitar tone that a legion of guitar players have chased ever since. Now, this is something that Marshall recognised in 1991 when they released a trio of pedals, all of which aimed at encapsulating the tone of specific amps. You had the Drive Master, the Shred Master, and the one that we're going to be taking a look at today, the Marshall BluesBreaker. Now, it's hard to find too much information in regard to how successful the BluesBreaker was upon its release. I've read some references to it being wildly successful, other references to the fact that it kind of flew under the radar, and to be honest, if I was to edge my bet, I would probably edge for the latter. It's a pedal with not much gain released at a time, and in conjunction with pedals with an infinitely more amount of gain on tap, of course being 1991, high gain really ruling the airwaves. I guess a pedal that was fairly subtle by all accounts, especially given the standards of the day, probably did fly under the radar. Now, bizarrely, it's that subtlety and that nuance, and really nailing that slight edge of breakup tone. Not so much kind of encapsulating the sound of the amp it was aiming for. I don't think the two really sound all that close, to be honest. But it's a remarkable sounding pedal that, despite really kind of flying under the radar at the time, it would seem, has later found success. Now, it was manufactured for several years, being discontinued around about 1993 or 1994, depending on what you read. But the one thing we can agree on is it's pretty much led dormant for about 10 years. Fast forward to 2005 and a forum post by one Mr. John Mayer referencing the BluesBreaker as rather a secret weapon of his when it comes to achieving great guitar tone. If you're looking for a good edgy tone, check out the Marshall BluesBreaker pedal from the early 90s. Not the BB2, bad, but the original. It's a great beefy sound that colours Strat pickups in a really interesting way. Now, as much as that forum post in 2005 undoubtedly set the wheels in motion in regard to cementing this pedal's status as a bit of a cult classic, it wasn't until 2010, and this time John referencing the pedal in a Guitarist magazine article, really sent the second-hand market into overdrive, pardon the pun. Totally coincidentally, I managed to pick a pedal up in about 2009, it would have been, just before John came out with this quote, for about the princely sum of £40 on eBay. And then, as I said, in 2010, everything started to go a little bit mad, and a good example of an original BluesBreaker these days will set you back somewhere between £200 and £300. Now, of course, as soon as the interest in any otherwise long forgotten or discontinued pedal spikes, so does the interest in more affordable, more sort of easily accessible replicas arise. And in that respect, we really are spoilt for choice when it comes to the BluesBreaker. Now, starting with my personal favourite and arguably the most accurate in terms of replicas, we have the Snouse Black Box 2. Now, this is in many ways a one-to-one clone of the original BluesBreaker, with a couple of updated modifications here and there, bringing it into the 21st century. But in every way, shape or form that matters, this pedal retains everything that's cool, unique and vibey about the original. Speaking of replicas, next up we have the Cherrytone Horsebreaker, the right hand side being again a one-to-one clone of the BluesBreaker, and interestingly the left hand side being a one-to-one clone of the Klon Centaur. Now, as much as I've not had a chance to stack the two sides yet, I can attest to the fact that the BluesBreaker is a very accurate clone, and funnily enough does maintain some of the idiosyncrasies of the original BluesBreaker, thereby meaning that the volume pots and the tone pots and the gain knob really have to be cranked in order to get the max or get any kind of level out of this pedal. Next up, we have the Analog Man King of Tone, a pedal in which the debate still rages online today in regard to how close this is and how truly accurate it does sound to original Marshall BluesBreaker. One thing is beyond debate, however, and that is a quote on Analog's Man website in which he says, "We totally redid the circuit with different diodes, chips, capacitor, treble boost modes, pretty much everything was changed. And of course the King of Tone is two pedal circuits in one box. So our KO2 pedal is not much like and does not much sound like a Marshall BluesBreaker." To be honest, I kind of agree with him. I'm going to do a shootout of all these pedals at the end to give you a better idea of how they sound in comparison to the original. But as I said, there are more differences in these pedals than there are commonalities. Speaking of pedals that are inspired by the Marshall BluesBreaker, lastly we have the JHS double barrel, or at least the left hand side of the double barrel, which is of course their morning glory. As much as I would say that, to be honest, in isolation the left hand side of this pedal does have a touch more brightness and kind of fizziness about it than the original Marshall BluesBreaker, it's worth mentioning that of course in the double barrel you then have a tube screamer inspired pedal on the right hand side, the sort of combination of which, if you're looking to get that kind of John Mayer tone circa continuum, I would very much say gets you in the ballpark. So there you have it. Now, in regard to answering the overall question of this video, i.e. is the Marshall BluesBreaker pedal worth the hype, it's worth mentioning at this point that any second-hand pedal, or any discontinued pedal more importantly, its value on the second-hand market is very much going to be driven by market demand. How many of them are available? Do people want them? Is anyone famous using them? And of course, when you combine all of these factors, as with the Klon Centaur, as with the Marshall BluesBreaker, you have the perfect storm for a pedal which is fetching increasingly silly prices in the second-hand market. Now, couple that with the fact that the original is no longer in production, and it doesn't seem as though Marshall have any plans to release it or re-release it, I would have absolutely zero reservations in recommending any number of the fantastic replicas that are available. As ever, a massive thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do subscribe and hit the bell icon below if you haven't already, and stick around for another episode of Friday Fretworks next week. Cheers guys, I'm Chris Buck, take care and I shall see you soon.